Good afternoon. It's Thursday, which means we're here talking about education. This week we've kicked it up a notch. You can now watch our live streams on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. I will be talking to, today I have a guest. I'll be talking to Drey Martone, an associate professor at the College of St. Rose, who is on technology in schools, and that's particularly relevant this week because the governor announced a plan to reimagine education when schools return after the COVID-19 closures. Hi, Drey, how's it going?
Hello. Good to be here.
So this week, and as always, you can post questions on YouTube, you can post questions on Twitter or on Facebook, and they will get to us and we'll try to address them. So the big news this week was the governor announcing a partnership with the Gates Foundation. And of course, the Gates Foundation has worked with SED in the past on prior projects, like I think My Brother's Keeper and more notably Common Core. Can you talk a little bit about, sort of its history and sort of its sort of reputation and its history with New York?
Sure. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in the history of it, but just I know that they've had different relationships where the Gates Foundation for a long time has been involved in education and looking at sort of ways that you could solve some issues that have been sort of pervasive in education. There's been some successes, but then a number that have struggled. And I think I admire that they're trying to solve these issues and that they're working on different problems. But I think a common complaint is that they don't always have the teachers and the people that are doing the work at the table. That sometimes it can feel as if these solutions, what they're proposing, are coming from the outside and being imposed upon teachers. I wouldn't say that that's universally, but in some of the issues where there's more concerns, that's been a complaint that I've seen. So I think that the Gates Foundation has, a long history of working in this field. The idea of their, expertise in technology and what's possible. So I can see why, Cuomo would turn to them given their past work. But I think it is critical that you really get teachers and representatives of what's happening on the ground level at the table. So, for example, I've done work in the past with the New York State Math STEM Master Teacher Program that's supported by the state government. It's a fantastic program that teachers apply to be a part of, and they form these regional cohorts where they're sharing these exemplary practices and professional development that they're doing, and it's a phenomenal group. I'm a reviewer of their applications, and to see what these teachers are doing and then the work that they do once they're accepted in this program is extraordinary. So tapping into groups like that, in addition to sort of having this external, more consultant level support, I think would be a really important combination.
And I thought some of the things, I know the way, the Gates Foundation is sometimes a little bit polarizing, sort of their philosophies, their accountability focused philosophy has sort of drawn mixed reviews. But, I did think one thing that was interesting that the governor said was it was sort of harnessing technology to address equity issues. So I think one thing that's happened as teachers were sort of on the fly trying to figure out how to deliver learning remotely is they've started to use technology to reach students with language needs or disabilities. And so I think that's something that, the state's trying to recognize and continue into when schools return. And that's what we've talked about.
Yes. I mean, the hope is I would, I sort of, before I got into teaching, I actually worked in consulting and did sort of management consulting. And I'd hope that we really study to what degree have those populations been supported during this time of change, because I think it really, there's a lot of discussion around the equity issue and, how are we supporting students with special needs in terms of the services that they're getting, English language learners. And I think there's a lot of tools that can be out there and that can be utilized, but just making sure how has it worked these past 2 months, these next 2 months, and then really study to what degree can we use that going forward. my whole goal is that you would use technology to empower teachers to work with their students, not to sort of replace what they can do. I think the teachers are such a critical conduit of how you support students.
And then when everyone goes back to school, won't there be sort of an emotional adjustment? And if I don't know, do you think that Gates Foundation has sort of internalized some of the criticism of its past partnerships with New York, that it wasn't inclusive enough of parents and teachers' feedback? Is that something?
Right. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm just not knowledgeable enough about sort of the Gates Foundation in depth in terms of what they're doing, but of how they've reacted to past criticism. But I think right now we're sort of at such a, vulnerable, sensitive moment where I think parents are seeing the struggles their children are going through. They're kind of being intimately involved. I think everybody is very aware of it. So I would think that they would be attuned to it. And I think the relationship between teachers and their students is just really special and so important. And I think people are seeing that now, where I'm seeing, students just hearing their teacher's voice or seeing their face on a screen. And, I saw one teacher in our area, was tutoring a student in a parking lot from a distance. That connection that teachers have to their students is so powerful. So I think everybody wants to do this right and wants to support students. So, and I think Cuomo heard this, we're not going to get rid of school buildings, that we have to understand how can we support the work that goes on in those buildings using technology to its fullest extent. And I could be on a webinar almost every second of every day, learning about different things about technology. And the ones that I'm on, to hear the excitement in the teachers' voices about what they're learning, and they're saying, I could use this tomorrow. Like, they're very engaged, and it's across the country, across the world. It's a really unifying time in education. So I've been very impressed.
Innovative too. It's a very innovative time. Teachers
exactly
figure it out.
Yeah. To see the ways, there's all these different ways the technology can be used, and to see the support of the technology companies, that they're very responsive. Everybody is sort of working together to figure out great solutions. So I say to my students at St. Rose, it's just such an exciting time to be in education, and I wouldn't want to see it become polarized, like with sort of any of these. I think let's build on this moment of how we can all work together, and I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah. Speaking of video conferencing, there was some debate about privacy and sort of, there are those who argue that schools are becoming a little too reliant on technology and outside vendors, and it puts student data at risk. I know, the STD recently quietly sort of banned facial recognition after there was a whole controversy about facial recognition systems in Lockport. And then we had that debate about Zoom in New York City. They were banning Zoom conferencing for privacy reasons. How do you think that schools can sort of balance that, like students' privacy versus like creating a modern, efficient, technologically forward classroom?
Yes, I think you really need to think about that, because I think there's just student data. I think historically the concern has been, as they're answering online assessments and that sort of data. But I think this online, like this facial aspect and the video, has taken it to a whole nother level. So there was a great opinion piece in the New York Times just this past weekend, talking from a professor at Queens College, talking about, when you're in a classroom, there's to some degree an expectation of now we're all together. Like, we have the common set of tools. We're sitting at the same desks. We have the same materials. But when you're in somebody's home, it's very different. And now you're seeing, I think there's some website now that's rating, newscasters' homes and things like that. And I think that's really, you're increasing the privacy, the personalization, is a whole nother factor that you need to figure out. Even doing this, I was thinking, where should I position the camera? And so that's a lot to put on students to think about that. Do they have their own space of where they're, doing their video conferencing? And so I think that would be a critical piece. So there's sort of the content that gets delivered over it, but then sort of that privacy piece of how you engaging students. I know in some districts, the student participation online is quite low, and could it be a factor because they don't have the access to it, or they sort of don't want their class in their home, which I think everybody is sort of struggling with that balance. So thinking about those pieces would be an important aspect.
And one thing I think that also happened, the governor announced a partnership with Eric Schmidt of Google to sort of address the broadband issue. One thing we found, this sort of remote learning school closure period sort of exposed some of those gaps in just access to internet access. Just giving out Chromebooks worked in maybe larger urban districts, but up in the mountains or in rural areas, there's no way to get internet. And that's something that, this sort of, I think, might speed it along.
And wouldn't that be great? Because actually, before I worked at St. Rose, worked in Massachusetts on developing a computer-based test for students that were in the adult education program. And it was so interesting, the feedback that we got from the students in these sort of GED type programs, they were thrilled because to move the test online meant kind of they were getting on computers, and the testing centers needed more computers, and it built sort of this infrastructure that it really helped to kind of leapfrog them into the use of technology. So yeah, I think that would be fantastic if you could increase the coverage and get that piece of the puzzle sort of solved. I think would then allow us to then focus on more the how can we use technology, not just getting technology.
I know you work with a lot of public schools in the area, specifically on STEM issues and math and science. And you're also a proponent of incorporating technology in the classroom. Well, can you tell me, what is it that do you tell schools they can do to teach better with these tools?
Yeah, I mean, in the past, I'd say what we saw more in schools was almost more of a consumption of technology. So it might have been time during the day where, students were working in different groups, and one group was on Chromebooks doing more sort of individual answering questions and submitting. So kind of an individualized curriculum, which is great for that purpose. Since this has all happened, the role of technology has definitely changed, where now you're using technology to create content. So not just consume content. And so you're seeing more, a use of Flipgrid or Edpuzzle or Pear Deck. There's all these tools that are out there. And I think that can be really powerful, but part of it is the privacy issue. So figuring out kind of how that all works. Then how can you help teachers to, I've been enjoying taking these webinars, you experience it as a student, and then you say, I could try this in my class tomorrow. So there are some great, webinars that are going on that you can learn about it, apply it hands-on in that experience, and then go use it. So for example, Teresa Wills does a daily, I actually missed it because we're doing this talk. She does a daily webinar where, she'll show you how you can use the technology, and then immediately I'll go and do it. So I participated also in this great Ed Camp Flipgrid, where they talked about all the different Google tools and different things, and basically took these ideas and then created what I was doing with students over at Pine Hills. We were going to classrooms and looking at how they could develop these cardboard games to test different objects about force and motion. So I took this idea and then developed through Flipgrid a sample lesson. And then my students in my math and science classes, then they all developed lessons that they could use with the students that they had been working with at Pine Hills and some of the other local Albany schools to teach the concept using technology remotely. So it kind of it's been interesting. It's this multi-level step, but it all comes back together in terms of how we can support students and get at sort of this meatier aspect of creating content as opposed to just sort of answering questions.
Yeah, so I got one question that comes in. It's along the lines of privacy. I guess they want to know how, is this kind of like we're just starting to learn more about the privacy aspects, right? I think the laws are just starting, New York State is finalizing its regulations regarding softwares that we could use. Are teachers becoming more savvy about how to use technologies in a way, or be more cautious about information, or schools, are they being more cautious about information they ask about students that are imported into software?
I think much more needs to be done, again, because this is a pretty big shift in terms of what we've seen in terms of the use of technology. So in the past, schools might have what's called like a clever, like this one login that can be used for all these different software programs. And schools were really working on how could you contain and sort of make sure those data are private. This, like you can have somebody right now recording or taking a screen capture of somebody talking, and I don't know how that's going to get used. Or you have somebody that, I've heard of, students that might bring the, their laptop into a part of the house, and then in the background, you're seeing something else going on.
Right.
So I really think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done around, either just norms of how you use the technology, and then, the real privacy aspects will be something that needs to be looked at much more.
Do you have any thoughts on, what schools might look like when students come back? We don't know yet if students will be stagnated, if there will be some sort of social distancing, but what do you anticipate will be sort of the adjustment period? What do you think, like emotionally and socially, students are going to be dealing with?
I mean, the social emotional piece, I've always thought is such a critical aspect of education. So, there was just a great sort of podcast recently. That's a whole nother thing of sharing ideas on podcast. Wendy Turner does a lot of work around social emotional learning about how you can embed that in the content. So it's not like a separate part of the day, how you teach and how you go about it. So I really hope there's a lot of emphasis on that. So, you might need more counselors or different supports. And I think, again, really empowering teachers. So it's not, I'm teaching math, but you can be teaching math in a way that sort of supports the students as they're going through this tough time, because it's going to have been a long time. I mean, it'll be, 4 months of not school and then summer. So that's a significant part. So when schools do go back, I mean, I've seen structurally that, some have already started. I just saw on Twitter, somebody taped off their room. And so, every student had their own individual space, and there's no class library. They had separate books, and there's a specific path they're going to walk. So, I mean, that's one approach of how do you carve it out. I don't know. I've heard people talking about, using the space differently, so smaller class sizes. But I mean, I strongly agree with what Cuomo was saying right now. To have a budget crisis on top of this is going to be a tremendous issue, because you need the teachers, you're going to need those supports. And if you're thinking smaller class sizes, so there's less movement, that's going to need more support. I really hope there's a lot of thought put into how we can support teachers in schools to do this really well, because it's an important opportunity. It can be done well. Like, I have no doubt that we can do it well, but it just needs to be sort of thoughtfully, and again, involve teachers in thinking through all these different steps.
And like the grading system has sort of been dialed down, the content has been dialed down, everything's sort of been, I think there's a lot of angst that kids won't be ready to move on to the next level of math or science or reading because they've had this sort of gap. Do you think that they're going to be able to hit the ground running when they get back into the building, or is it going to be sort of an adjustment period and we're just going to have to be patient?
I mean, I think that they can definitely sort of, content-wise, there might be, there's always sort of a summer slide anyway. So you'll have that. But I think it'd be interesting to see if out of this time comes a different thought about education. There's been a lot of discussion about this idea of like Genius Hour and passion projects and how we can use technology to teach the skills, but allow students some more flexibility in how they want to share their ideas or how they want to do the research or different tools that are out there. So I think there could be some really creative, exciting ways that come together. There has been historically this push of almost sort of this top-down, give teachers this curriculum, this set of textbooks, and that they need to follow along and do. And I'm hoping one of this is, let's take a step back and, again, empower teachers to think more about how we can work with from where the students are, know where they want them to be, and how we can sort of close that gap in creative ways. So I'm just going to give you one example from my past. When I taught fourth grade down in New York City, I was one time at a Catholic school up in Harlem. And, I was using the textbooks and doing it. And students who weren't really engaged in what was happening. We actually applied for a technology grant and got $25,000 worth of technology in the classroom. And we did this project where we researched the A train through Manhattan. And we took the students out on field trips and they researched these communities and they worked in groups and they were producing things with technology. And to see the change in the students, they were just so engaged and passionate about this project, and they were doing things in a different way. The behavior changed, their work changed, everything. So I always use that as an example with my students. We can really get them there, but we just need to think about how we can use the tools and engage with the students we have in a very purposeful way that makes them motivated to learn.
Yeah. So we got a comment from, I think, on one of our platforms. He said, Half Pint says, many of us don't want Google or Gates involved. Tap into the New York State talent instead of billionaires. I do want to note that SCD is convening a task force, which does include a wide, panel of stakeholders, teachers, parents, educators, policymakers, and that is going to inform the governor's task force as they develop a reopening plan. So there was announced a plan to create an avenue for various stakeholders to weigh in. But there is sort of, the Google and having like billionaires involved, it sort of draws this like polarized response every time.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have an expertise. The Google products are very, very helpful in this time. To see the collaboration that can be done with the Google suite of different education, they really have done a lot. So I think there's a benefit to bringing in that expertise and having it at the table. But I think then you have the people that are doing the work, and you have the parent perspective and the teachers and different people supporting students. So absolutely, I think getting those stakeholders and really letting their voice be heard, and so I think, you don't want to just say, the consultants are saying this, but, what is everybody saying around the table, and really sharing that out, because I think, again, through technology, there should be no reason that we shouldn't see what's happening at that table, because I think there could be a misperception that, again, it's just being imposed upon. And I'd really like to hear more about that collaboration and sharing of ideas.
Okay, so this question kind of ties into the technology in schools. Can kids make use of, what's the difference between K through 2 versus the higher grades? This is something when I went to visit preschools that are staying open, I guess, for essential workers. A lot of preschools don't use any technology because they're sort of center-based and they're trying to delay technology in the classroom. But in light of the COVID-19 closures, a lot of them have changed the policy because they're helping kids do their homework on these iPads. And so I think that's a shift that I wonder if it's going to continue into next year when schools reopen. Yeah.
I think, excessive amount of screen time is definitely a concern. And I think, I say at all ages. I've seen in classrooms where when the screens come out, everybody, I call it like falling into the screens, like you just get consumed by it. So I'm hugely aware of that. And I think there is a lot of discussion about, non-screen based learning. And that's where I talk about this, creation as opposed to just consumption. So for example, there's this great group doing like math sidewalk chalk. And so, you do these math activities outside, using sidewalk chalk, and there's excellent examples of what you can do there. And then you could use something like Flipgrid. The students could take a picture of it and then can create a video of themselves explaining what they're doing and post that. And they could comment on other people's videos and things like that. So it's not necessarily sitting in front of the computer, but you're using it as a tool to share something that you did. So I think you could really do a lot, at the younger grades, so the K2 and preschool, a lot of schools are using Seesaw, and that's a way that you can kind of create some different tools. But I think this idea of,
who don't, what is Seesaw for those of us who don't have younger?
Oh, sure, yeah. So both Seesaw and Flipgrid are ways that you can almost create a digital journal that students can take pictures and narrate their work and then send it to like a class portfolio that the teacher can look at it and people can look at each other's work. That's been used, Seesaw especially has been used a lot, and I think Flipgrid to some degree, but both of those I've seen a tremendous increase. And so that is a great way that you can create this class community where you're hearing people's voices, you're seeing them, and they're sharing their work in a very purposeful way. And so I think there's lots of tools, but I think it is good to be conscious of how much time people are on screens, and that there's ways that you can do things offline. But what I would also like to see more of is also ways to create kind of a community online. So I think it's tough in some settings. Teachers, have 20 kids that are coming to a Zoom meeting or Google Meet meeting like this. That's tough. Even when I'm in these webinars, I'm not going to talk if there's 20 people. But if you put me in a breakout room where it's smaller and it's like this, then it's a discussion. So I think facilitating that, and what does that look like? And again, I think there's some great tools that you can use to sort of have some accountability when they're in their little rooms, the virtual rooms. They can be, using a shared Google slide where they're writing down their notes of what they're discussing. And then the teacher can kind of see what's going on in each of the rooms because she's seeing kind of what they're producing on their slide. So there's a lot of ways technology can be used, but I think we want to really support teachers in this process. And I think they've done a huge effort in terms of what they've accomplished in such a short time. So I think really,
what sort of technologies have come out of this crisis? Like, what have they, what new programs are they starting to use to help, adjust this period?
Yeah, there was a great, and I can send you links. If there's some place that you want to post links, I could send you some examples of these things. But just for example, I think I mentioned Flipgrid. So again, this is very easy. You post a stimulus material, like a video of yourself talking, and then students just push on a green plus button and they record a video of themselves responding. And it could be a picture, different things. But then through that tool, they create this Ed Camp, which is sort of a bottom-up conference for teachers created by teachers, where they had these 19 different topics that were voted on teachers across the country participating in this, saying these are topics we want to talk about. And then they were sharing all these different tools, so from that, I learned more about Pear Deck, which is built into Google Slides. It's like within Google Slides, it's just an add-on that you click on, and it makes your Google Slides interactive. So you can have multiple choice questions, you can have open response questions, you could have students drawing, you could have, Likert scales that they're doing, you can have images and they drag a dot around. So it's this great way that then produces this export of all the student data. So like when I use that with my students, we do it as a whole class, but then they took ownership of that and they created what's called like student paste. So it's almost like a homework assignment that students can do on their own time. So, Pear Deck was one. The Flipgrid I mentioned. Screencastify has been a great one where you can screen record yourself, and that you could immediately feed into this other tool called Edpuzzle, that then you could embed questions throughout the video. So all of these types of tools have been out there, but they've been very responsive. So that link between Edpuzzle and Screencastify just happened within this past week, different things. So the technology companies are being very responsive and also very free. So right now, almost everything is free. So I say to my students at St. Rose, now's the time to get on Twitter, learn about these things, and just start exploring because it's all out there.
That's amazing. So it's sort of an opportunity to experiment with different softwares and see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. And I really would encourage people, if you're interested in education and technology, get on Twitter. You could follow, like if you followed me, it's just at Drey Martone, and see who I follow. That's what I say to my students. And I started just as like a voyeur, like I was just watching what other people are doing. But it is very rich professional development. There's not a day that I go on there that I don't learn something, and so now I started retweeting, and I think I just like created my own original content like for the first time. But that's where I learned about these other like webinars that are going on, and then you're meeting other people. It's a great time.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One thing we talked about last time I interviewed you for a story about homeschooling, now that every parent in America has suddenly become a homeschooler to an extent. And you talked about like using, the whole entire world is going through this trauma together. And it's really made the world feel a little smaller. And we talked about sort of the opportunity to engage with students across the globe and how that can enrich the classroom. And it's 100% free, and it's, the technology, we have it already. Can you talk about that? Like how you think that classrooms could incorporate that tool?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think just everybody is experiencing this. So, there's a lot of ways that you could, again, these sorts of things you could set up with another classroom. There's tremendous things that are online free. So for example, like NASA has, have a scientist come to your classroom. And so you could have the scientist in, 2 different classrooms and share different ideas. You can really, Google has, Google Earth that you could talk about, your surrounding area and what's there, and then compare it to somebody else's. That's what I think, if you think about the critical literacy skills, there's sort of, I'll always say, because I do a lot in STEM,
Yeah.
you can integrate those, writing sequence, persuasive writing, narrative writing. You can apply these different types of writing, compare and contrast thinking to anything. And so when you're connecting with somebody in a different location about a similar topic, you can really share ideas in a very purposeful way.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you a shout out again for people who are just joining us. I'm speaking to Drey Martone, who's an associate professor at the College of St. Rose, who teach teachers how to teach. And she is talking to us about technology and education. So if you have any questions, you can post them on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, and we will try to address them. And we're just sort of talking about it in context of the state trying to figure out how to rebuild education when schools return and when the state reopens after the pandemic. So any closing thoughts about, technology and how you hope that, how schools will be different when we return?
I do. I had one closing thought, because it's funny, when I would say I really enjoy technology, and I always have, but through this even more. But it's funny, when I got out of college, I was actually computer phobic. I wrote papers out by longhand. Like I literally cut and pasted and moved things around by hand. Yeah. I just was not comfortable with computers. My first job, I was required to use it, and I learned, and I, read books about it, and I became sort of an expert at Excel, and I saw how powerful it could be and how it could, make things so much easier. Then I went on to go teach other people about Excel, and then, as I said, I, got that grant about using technology, and it's just increased since then. And so I just want, teachers right now, I feel like, are struggling with so many things. Our parents are struggling with so many things, but just to know that change is possible, that, there's so many things that we can learn, between on YouTube or on Twitter, that we can figure all these things out, that we can all support each other. And it can be a really exciting time where we can use technology to solve problems and connect and do things easier and better. So I think it's a fun time in education. I just hope we all continue to kind of work together to think about ways that we can really support all students with a range of different needs very purposefully.
Yeah. I guess the other thing we didn't really touch on was budgets. I think we touched on it a little bit. This week we spoke about, we wrote about school budgets, and pretty much every district in the region and in the state is really going to have a shortfall they're trying to close. And that's if, budget state funding stays flat, and it seems like there's a possibility that it'll be reduced mid-year because of the provision in the state budget. And then on top of that, they have the uncertainty of not knowing what schools will look like when they come back, if they have to stagnate classes or invest in PPE or invest in these other costs. Is technology something that you think can potentially save schools, make schools more efficient, or will it be another expense? Do you think that it's going to be a added expense for school districts that are already being forced to cut programs in sports and arts and stuff like that?
Yeah, I really strongly believe there should be no cuts because I don't think that technology will save anything. I think technology is just a tool. And I think you need the bodies there, and you're going to need more bodies there. I think you're going to need, if you want smaller class sizes, you can't have, one teacher in a room with kids just on screens. I think that teachers and all the support people in the school are going to be even more critical. So I would encourage everybody to, go to your politicians and say, the fact that state funding has not been addressed, I think Cuomo has really made some good, strong points about how that needs to happen. And I think it's really an issue. So I think if we were to be doing cuts right now, it would just, there's nothing about technology that will help save it. I think there cannot be cuts. That's all. I just really hope that we don't see that, because I think we need to support the students and the teachers that are there in the school communities. So I really hope that that doesn't happen, and we turn to technology as a tool of how we can do things differently and support people, but it's not going to replace the people that we need there.
And to just follow through on that storyline, I think the governor and the state is asking, the federal government to get a couple $1 billion more so that the state doesn't have to cut budgets in the middle of the year.
And that's what, I think he's really presented that well, that there was in 2 rounds of funding, and so to not include states in that, and I think he argues well with McConnell back and forth about that whole point, because I think it really makes sense that, there should be another round of funding that supports states that have been faced with this issue. So I really hope that we communicate that at the federal level, and don't start thinking that, there have to be cuts, because I don't think that there should be.
Yeah, public schools have it really hard. Like, colleges got grants from the stimulus funding. Even charter schools, private schools are eligible for like small business funding, and it's only public schools that really had the full amount of their relief aid sort of deducted from their state aid. So they're losing money this year, and it's really, I think, going to be a challenge, like a logistical challenge for a lot of schools in our area.
Yeah. I think we can all come together and we can work together, and there's definitely solutions that can be done. But to layer on cuts and sort of disrupting all the school communities as we're trying to work through this, I think just adds a whole layer of strife that should not be there. If the aid has been given to all these others, it should be given to schools.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining.
Excellent. Thanks for taking this time.
I'll see you later.